Oh, senior scholars, I'm back. So, what we want to pick up with is uh, the winter of 77 78. Arnold will travel south to join up with Washington after Saratoga, and he'll end up spending the winter with the Continental Army at Valley Forge. You've all studied Valley Forge before and how horrible it was there, and they were still with lacking supplies because the French money hadn't come through yet, and so forth. And Arnold's with Washington there that winter in Valley Forge. In February of 78, he's finally promoted to Major General by the Continental Congress, and that's going to give him seniority over these generals who were promoted before him because of his past record. Now, on May 28th, 1778, Washington will name him the military commander of Philadelphia, which Arnold is not really happy about because at that point there aren't many troops stationed in Philadelphia, as the Americans had pulled out of there, the British had evacuated there also, and it's really more or less a desk job. But Washington does this hoping that this will give Arnold additional time to recover from that horrible wound that he had suffered in October of 77 at Saratoga. So this is where Arnold will meet the Shippen family. Edward Shippen IV was a prominent Philadelphia merchant and judge. And Arnold will fall in love with his 18-year-old daughter, Margaret Peggy Shippen. And she's just commonly known as Peggy. The unfortunate part of this for Arnold is the Shippen family are a family of loyalists. And they have ties to the British Army. And they unfortunately also have ties to the major culprit in all this on the British side, Major John Andre, who was the chief intelligence officer for General Sir Henry Clinton, who commanded the New York forces. So, this romance will carry on for about a year. Arnold will marry Peggy Shippen on April 8th, 1779, at age 19, and he'll be, part of the Shippen family then. There'll be more and more meetings with Andre at the Shippen house over dinner and so forth. Then, about a month later, in May of 79, Arnold will contact Joseph Stansbury, another prominent loyalist, or, when I was a kid, they called them Tories, in Philadelphia, who he had met through the Shippens, and told him to relay messages to the British that he was interested in joining them and spying for them. So Stansbury relayed this information to Major Andre, and the British will end up messaging Arnold and telling him they'll take him up on his offer and to just remain in his position in the American military so he could serve as a spy. Then, in August of 1779, Arnold, as far as he's concerned, gets a promotion, and he's named the commander of West Point. Now, West Point is closer to military action. There's a fort at West Point, and they also have a fortress right across the Hudson River. And the Americans have used this as a place to ultimately stop any further northern incursions into New York by the British by placing a large chain across the river to stop any British ships from sailing north past that spot on the Hudson. They're able to do it there. If you've ever been to the West Point area, there's a very narrow bend in the river that is really wide in other spots in that general vicinity. And they stretch this giant chain. And I've seen you may have seen this before. There's a couple links of the chain on display at the New York State Capitol in Albany. And the links of the chain, are each link is as big as me. So, it's stretched across the river. No ship's going to sail through that. It would crush their hull. So Arnold's in charge of the fort there, the fort across the river, and there's an accompanying forts further south on the Hudson, all in this big defensive posture by the Americans. Now, so on September 21st of the next year, after Arnold had been in place for a year at West Point and was very familiar with everything there, all the defenses and so forth of that and the other fortresses, Arnold and Major Andre have a secret meeting in the night at West Point discussing the final details of the British sneaking in and taking over the fortress at West Point, because Arnold is supplying him with detailed drawings and other information on troop placement and whatnot. And they come to an agreement that the British will pay Arnold 20,000 British pounds for this supplying of information. 20,000 British pounds in 1780 is a small fortune. And that's the agreement they reach. 2 days later, as Andre is returning back to New York to report to Henry Clinton with the information he's gathered from Arnold, he is apprehended by New York militia on Route 9 in Tarrytown. Along the way, Andre had been stopped. He was masquerading as a civilian. And in this particular instance, the sentries who were part of this New York militia group grew suspicious of him, according to one account. Another account that I've read is that these two guys decided to rob him, and they were searching him completely, and they ended up finding documents in his shoe, and then they quickly changed their robbery plans and turned over all these documents they ended up finding on Andre to the United States Army. So, on September 25th, everything falls apart for Benedict Arnold and Peggy Arnold Shippen. On that day had been a planned event for a little bit that General Washington was going to travel north from Newburgh, where his headquarters were on the Hudson at this point, and he was going to inspect the facilities at West Point and visit his old friend, General Arnold, and he'd also become a close acquaintance of Peggy, by this time Arnold's wife. Now, earlier that morning on the 25th, before Washington and his aides will arrive at West Point, and with Washington is General Lafayette, the French general, who's part of this inspectionary team also. Earlier in the morning, though, riding ahead of Washington is Alexander Hamilton, his aide-de-camp, and some of his top men. They rode ahead to visit Benedict Arnold and Peggy Arnold, who Hamilton knew both of them quite well, and they were supposed to have breakfast. They had breakfast with Benedict Arnold Peggy Arnold remained in bed, and the story was that she was feeling ill. Arnold was probably afraid she'd be too nervous to meet with these people because she was in on this. She knew what was happening. So, next to arrive at the house was a courier who had a message that announced it was delivered to Arnold. Arnold opened it, but it was also a message that was supposed to be shared with General Washington when he arrived, that Andre had been apprehended in Tarrytown. So at that point, Arnold knew they were caught. It's just a matter of time. So Arnold went upstairs, told Peggy, who was still in bed, that it's over. They've found us out. So Arnold then comes downstairs, tells Hamilton that he has to go. He's been summoned down to the fort at the river bank from his home, which, he's staying in a place called the Robinson House, which is his residence while at West Point commanding, to check on something, a typical military duty. So Hamilton doesn't think anything of it. He doesn't know what was attached to Andre's capture. So Arnold takes this chance to quickly get in a rowboat, get out to the British ship, the Vulture, that will allow him to escape from West Point. The Vulture will take him down to New York City, first he'll escape to Philadelphia area, then he'll get to New York City ultimately, trying to elude people who have started a manhunt later on by that time, and he'll escape behind enemy lines in New York and escape to General Clinton. In the meantime, George Washington arrives at the Robinson house that Arnold and Peggy were staying at. Arnold's gone. Peggy Arnold finally gets up, pulls some crazy act where she says she's feeling ill. Oh my God, what's happened? I don't know anything about anything, because what had happened is a second message from a courier arrived at the Robinson house. It's directly delivered to General Washington, and in it, it tells exactly what had gone on with Andre and what he had in his possession when he was apprehended. He then allows Peggy to return to Philadelphia because he believes her story that she knew nothing about Arnold's exploits. And so really, the two of them end up escaping. In the meantime, Andre is questioned by Washington. He's put on trial. And on October 2nd, Major Andre is found guilty and will be hanged for spying at Tappan, New York. Now, but on January 5th, 1781, Arnold, who had now been given the rank of Brigadier General in the British Army, will lead a British raid on Richmond, Virginia. Richmond is basically undefended. Arnold sends messages to Thomas Jefferson telling him that since it's undefended, he won't harm the city or any of its buildings or inhabitants, and then turns around and burns half the city, which just leads to more hatred towards Benedict Arnold. Not only is he a treasonous devil now, he's a bold-faced liar as far as American patriots are concerned. Then, on September 6th, 1781, British Brigadier General Arnold will lead raids on his old home state of Connecticut, which is also questionable activities. And it's really not clear if he volunteered to do this or the British decided that, who better to send up there than Arnold. And what they were up to in September 6th of 1781, they were trying to divert Washington and his force of men, including French generals Deschambault and Lafayette, who were preparing to converge on Yorktown. So it's really a diversionary act by the British. Arnold will raid New London, but he'll be stopped across the Thames River, which runs through the middle of New London, if you've ever been there before, at Groton Heights, Connecticut, which is right across the river from New London. He'll be stopped there at an American fort, Fort Griswold, and Arnold's men will be defeated that day and have to retreat. Now, the war will come to an end in October 6, 1781, or not October 6, but October of 1781 at Yorktown. This diversionary activity didn't work. Washington didn't buy it, and they will defeat General Cornwallis at Yorktown, and Cornwallis's surrender will end the fighting in the Revolutionary War in October of 1781. So, in December of 1781, Arnold will go to England and attempt to receive a regular commission in the British Army, which they denied him. Arnold's caught in a precarious situation now. He's a detested traitor here in his home country of America, who's just won their independence from Britain, and the British never will really trust him. They figure if he'll turn on his own country for 20,000 British pounds, which he never did receive that payment, he'll receive 6,000 pounds and a pension in lieu of it from the British government for the rest of his life. They figure if he'll turn on his home country, he'll turn on us for the right amount of money. So we can't trust this guy. We really don't want him in the British military. So when he's denied a regular commission in the British Army, which obviously combat and battlefield activities are his true love, he decides that he's going to pursue business ventures. Because remember, that's his real background as a pretty successful businessman in Connecticut. So his business ventures from 1782 to 1791 will include going to Canada, British Canada for a while, and speculating in land. He'll carry on some privateer trading in the West Indies. And then ultimately, he'll return to London, England in 1791. That's where he'll live for the next 10 years with his wife, Peggy. And ultimately, Benedict Arnold will die on June 14th, 1801, and he'll be buried at St. Mary's Church in Battersea, London. So, Benedict Arnold was a hero here in the North Country. Benedict Arnold, unfortunately, though, for various reasons, and I'm not trying to justify what he did, but turned on his country. Part of it was the treatment he received by the Continental Congress, never really being rewarded for his, great victories in the battlefield. Also, part of it is, Arnold once he was, one thing I didn't really cover in much detail was when he was brought up on charges in February of 1779 in Pennsylvania by the former adjunct general of the Army, Joseph Reed. The Continental Congress refused to intervene fully on his behalf, and he'll end up being found guilty on two of those charges, and it seems, a bit ridiculous for what he was guilty of. He was guilty of using government wagons for his own use and issuing a pass to a ship that he had monetary interests in. That's all they could get him on. And another theory that I want to introduce you to as far as Arnold and why he may have found the payment of 20,000 British pounds in 1780 so alluring is his wife, Peggy Shippen. She came from a very, very wealthy family. She was extremely beautiful and quite young. Remember, Arnold marries her when she's 19 years old, and Arnold, by that point, is approaching 40. She was used to the finer things in life. And part of the problem why there were a lot of officers mad at Washington in the first place, as far as that Newburgh conspiracy, was the last people to be paid by the Continental Congress in the Continental Army were officers. They had to pay the enlisted men or they'd just flat out desert, and you couldn't have that. So they were always giving the officers basically what amounted to IOUs. So Arnold was constantly broke. And Peggy Shippen was used to the finer things in life. To give you an idea of how bad this really was, all the way when we get to 1790, and Alexander Hamilton is the Secretary of the Treasury, he's looking through all the government books, trying to put our brand new government in order for his boss, President Washington. And he discovers that there's a large number of American officers in 1790 who still have not been paid for their service during the Revolution. And a lot of these officers, including General Philip Schuyler, in lieu of pay will be given huge land grants. Schuyler received huge tracts of land in New York, and others will too. That's how acute this problem was. So, Arnold with Peggy Shippen, who's used to the finer things in life, some historians argue, here he is making no money, and he's got a wife with champagne and caviar tastes. He was deeply afraid that sooner or later she's going to get fed up. She's, a very attractive young lady coming from the upper echelon of Philadelphia, that she would leave Arnold for greener pastures, so to speak. So Arnold, initially believing he's going to get this small fortune of 20,000 British pounds sterling, it's in order to make sure, in his mind, some argue, that Peggy will never, ever leave him. Because that's how much in love he was with Peggy. So, regardless, it doesn't justify betraying your country like that. But he did, and it's unfortunate for him, and he'll end up living the rest of his life after the war, never returning to the country he helped forge, the United States of America. So, that's it for our examination of Benedict Arnold's very complex life. It's been a pleasure sharing my information on the Rev War and the Champlain Valley with you over the past 6 weeks. I look forward to our last class meeting on Thursday, not because it's our last, but I look forward to talking about Benedict Arnold with all of you over Zoom. So I'll be sending out the material for this week. Review it. It won't be as intensive as the past. And I'll see you Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. So everybody be safe. Take care. See you then. Bye now.